In the previous episode, Commodore George Anson set out with a squadron of 8 ships to the Pacific Ocean on a secret mission to destroy Spanish interests in Latin America in the War of Jenkins Ear. But the journey around the Cape had been fraught with disaster. The ships were taking such beatings on the most mad seas of the roaring 50s that sails ripped, rigging snapped, and masts broke. Crews were dying at an alarming rate from disease, cold, and violently being tossed around in the ships. And even sick and dead captains had been replaced. Some believed they'd never make it out of the Drake Passage, and that one mountainous wave would send them to the bottom. Several ships had already disappeared, and now the HMS Wager lost sight of the flagship, the Centurion, and then all other ships sailed out of view. The Wager was alone at sea. I'm Yvette, this is Defragged History. Thank you for tuning in to episode 2 of the story of the HMS Wager, how it started, how it ended, and everything in between. Links to sources, music, and other info are in the description. This video was made possible with the help of my Patreon subscribers. Thanks for all your support. And now, let's make all the pieces fit. Once alone, the HMS Wager sailed out of the Drake Passage at last and headed north along the Patagonian coast into the Pacific Ocean. They wanted to make the rendezvous point off the island of Nostra Señora del Socorro and catch up with the rest of the squadron. Then they would attack Valdivia and make a dent in the Spanish hold over the region. Since the Wager had the bulk of the squadron's artillery stores plus a large contingent of the Marines, they couldn't afford to dally. If Captain Cheap failed to reach Commodore Anson, they couldn't complete the mission, and Cheap was convinced that if he pulled it off, he'd be the hero of the entire expedition. While the crew didn't have to worry about provisions yet, they had to start rationing water. Not everyone agreed with this. A sailor demanded Steward Peter Plasto that he give him the same amount of water as before. The steward replied, "No, goddamn ye, now the Commodore is gone, you shall find the difference." To the captain's ear, both the question and the answer were the early rumbling sounds of a mutiny, and mutinies could take ships down as fast as a giant wave could. The captain ordered the gunner John Bulkeley to secretly supply each officer on board with a brace of pistols to nip any of that nonsense in the bud. On May 1st, 1741, Captain Cheap conferred with his officers about the state of the Wager. It was agreed that because of the loss of the chain plates, they should cut away the best bower or starboard anchor to prevent further damage to the foremast. For some reason, this wasn't done right away. On May 10th, 1741, 2 weeks after losing sight of the squadron, Captain Cheap was certain the rendezvous point, Socorro Island, was only 3 days away. Meanwhile, his crew withered away, with some ready to give up. But Cheap, still suffering from his rheumatism/scurvy, wouldn't stop. Couldn't stop. He was following orders, and with bosun John King ill in his hammock for weeks now, he told Midshipman Alexander Campbell to bring the crew to heel and enforce his orders. For honor, for glory, for Britain. The weakened men had to do the back-breaking work of pumping the water out of the hold, replacing the rigging and bending new sails, all while chucking their dead companions overboard. The crew began to despise the stubborn captain and the unrelenting midshipman. Ship's master Thomas Clark said they remained safely west of the Chilean coast, but who could trust dead reckoning anymore? They weren't stupid. They saw rockweed, and seaweed meant shore, and shore meant a single gust of wind could push them onto some unknown land and wreck the ship. This was pretty much a guarantee now, since the ship was a half-wreck and the crewmen were total wrecks. This was madness. Complete and utter madness. Several officers muttered that they should alter course and turn west further out to sea. They spoke to Cheap's second-in-command, the 40-something Lieutenant Robert Baines, in charge of the watch. He simply said that the captain insisted on following orders and making the rendezvous, despite the wrecked state of the ship. Gunner Bulkeley told the lieutenant to forget about Socorro. It was too close to shore. It would be safer for the Wager if they went to the Juan Fernandez Island further out west instead. Well, that wasn't the lieutenant's call, but Cheap's. Talk to him. That was a little above Bulkeley's pay grade. The crew saw the gunner pacing around, seething with rage. They trusted Bulkeley's opinion over the newly appointed captain. Many cursed this dangerous course they were on. Captain Cheap became aware of the disgruntled rumblings. This was another pending mutiny he had to stop. He called for Bulkeley. "Speak up, what's the problem?" They were too close to land. The master reckoned they were 100 miles from shore. Bulkeley said 30, if that. The captain calmly told the gunner that he understood that Bulkeley and the others on board wanted to bear away for Juan Fernandez, but they'd all be wrong. The Commodore had appointed Socorro for the first rendezvous because they were about to attack Valdivia, and Cheap would move heaven and earth to get there. But he compromised. He'd stand off to Socorro for 24 hours, and if they didn't see any others of the squadron, he'd proceed to Juan Fernandez. Dismissed. While many on the ship recognized that the gunner had no business telling off a superior, most everyone thought Bulkeley's assessment was the correct one. The Wager moved north, parallel to the coastline. No matter how much the crew tried to gather further out to sea, the western wind and the currents pushed the Wager ever closer to the shore, until they were stuck in a bay called Golfo de Penas, the Gulf of Distress, which sounds like a happy place to be. On May 13, 1741 at 8 a.m., several pulleys for the foresails broke, bringing the foreyard down around the crewmen's ears. Captain Cheap ordered Midshipman Campbell to reef the foreyard as soon as possible, but with so few healthy crewmen, this couldn't be done quickly. Carpenter John Cummins, checking the remaining chain plates, thought he saw land from the forecastle and pointed the lieutenant to it. Baines peered into the distance. No, it couldn't be. They were sailing over 150 miles from shore. He asked a few others, but none saw any land. Cummins was dismissed as delusional, and Baines didn't report the sighting to the captain. Cheap rushed to the aid of the crew when the topsails detached from the yards, but he promptly fell down the after ladder, landing on the deck 6 feet below. Crunch! He dislocated his left shoulder. Cheap was stunned, as several crewmen quickly gathered him up to bring him to the surgeon's cabin, but not before he ordered all hands they could muster to stand watch. They mustered 12 men. Everyone else was sick or panicking. It was tough to see anything out there. The wind was outrageous, the rain very violent, and it was so gloomy that all beyond 20 yards was invisible. In the surgeon's cabin, Surgeon Walter Elliott gave the captain opium for the pain, but his shoulder couldn't be popped back until hours later. At 2 p.m., gunner John Bulkeley climbed up the foremast to help lower the loose yard when he saw land. Plain as day. Not just land. It was a massive craggy cliff. Bulkeley zipped down the mast and raced to warn the captain, who was baffled. He called for the lieutenant and told him and the gunner to do whatever necessary to save the ship. But there weren't enough hands to crowd sail so she could bear away. They had 12 men. Other able-bodied crewmen just gave up and couldn't be convinced to save themselves. The man in charge, Lieutenant Baines, even grabbed a bottle of brandy and went below deck, apparently no longer caring about what happened to His Majesty's ship. The Wager had no functional mizzenmast. The rigging was shot afore to abaft and the sails too rotten because there hadn't been men healthy enough to repair them. But they could execute a jibe, a pivot, basically a U-turn. The helmsman pulled at the wheel. There was some movement, but the hurricane-like wind in the sail pushed the Wager closer to the rocks ever faster. The captain ordered the helmsman to keep turning the wheel and for the crew to adjust the rigging. In the nick of time, the Wager completed the U-turn and avoided a collision. Phew-wee, that was a very close call. Thursday, May 14, 1741, at 4:30 a.m., the Wager shuddered. First the crew thought it was nothing, just a great sea under the counter, and then they were hit with an even more dreadful shock than before. As if caught in a raging pinball machine, the Wager moved forward and kept hitting rocks, which the crew could now see sticking out above the water. To leeward were only breakers. Breakers destroy ships. At 7 a.m., the ship started sailing through the breakers, with rocks above water on either side. The wager would soon be ripped to pieces. The captain ordered to cut the best bower, but with the pulley over the cathead they couldn't clear it. The wager plowed forward and hit a third rock which broke the tiller, disabling the rudder, and the massive anchor belonging to the Centurion, which lay in the main hatchway, crashed through her bottom. With the rudder gone, they had to steer only using the sails, while the ship filled with water so fast that anyone who was still in their hammock simply drowned. Some remained brave in the face of certain doom, like the helmsman who, despite having nothing to steer with, stayed at his post. But most of the crewmen rolled around with every shock of the waves, with some not even trying to hold on to anything anymore. Others went mad. One man stalked around the deck, waving a sword over his head, calling himself the king of the country, striking anyone who came near, until mercifully one of his companions knocked him out. One man was so in shock seeing the foaming breakers all around the ship that he wanted to throw himself overboard, but others held him back. The ship moved through the gulf of distress, rudderless, crippled, a hole in its hull, and no captain on deck. It was over. But the master's mate, John Jones, a veteran sailor, wouldn't hear of anyone giving up and cried out for everyone to hear. "My friends, let us not be discouraged. Did you never see a ship amongst breakers before? Let's try to push her through them. Come, lend a hand. Here's a sheet and here's a brace. Lay hold. I don't doubt but we may stick her yet near enough to the land to save our lives." Jones didn't believe for 1 second this would work. However, his words snapped a few officers and crewmen out of their despair, and they jumped into action to try to steer the ship to relative safety. So they get stranded close to shore instead of going down with the ship. Some hauled up the mainsail, others used the brace and sheets to steer toward the land, while still others bailed water. But they just couldn't reach the shallow waters of the shore to save the crew, and the wager was about to go under into the deep blue ocean. But then, as luck would have it, or as the sailors called it by providence, she slipped between two rocks. There, perched, the wager was stuck, unable to float nor sink. The crew immediately cut away the main and foremast to prevent the ship, now half out of the water, from keeling over. Then daybreak came. Midshipman John Byron climbed to the lookout and peered into the distance. When the weather cleared for just a moment, "Land ho!" 16-year-old midshipman John Byron was the younger son of William, the 4th Baron Byron. His elder brother, William, the 5th Baron Byron, and peer in the House of Lords, was mentally unwell and later became known as the Wicked Lord for his cruel behavior. John Byron, on the death of his father and with his brother in charge of the estate, was forced to look for a job. He could have joined the army, like most of his peers, but he longed for adventure and chose the Navy instead, a step down for someone of his station. On the ship and in the journals, fellow officers consistently referred to him as the Honorable John Byron. Byron ran to tell Captain Cheap, doped up on opium in the surgeon's cabin, about the sight of land a musket shot away. Cheap, who until moments ago had been blissfully unaware of the wager's wrecking, was in trouble. Since he, the captain, had not been on deck during this emergency, he could basically kiss his naval career goodbye. He'd lost His Majesty's ship, and he'd be blamed for it. But Cheap had his defense ready. He dislocated his shoulder when he fell on his way to help the crew, and it was the surgeon who had persuaded him to take the opium, telling him it was to prevent fever. Cheap calmly ordered the midshipmen to lower the vessels strapped on the deck to get everyone to safety, starting with the sick. Byron asked the captain to go ashore. The ship would break apart soon. But Cheap said go and save all the sick, and no, he wasn't one of the sick. He'd be the last one to leave. The largest of the vessels, the 36-foot scuttled longboat, was buried under debris, but they could launch the other 3 boats, the cutter, the barge, and the yawl. Except they had cut the masts and couldn't lower them. Gunner Bulkeley, one of the toughest officers still standing, took charge of the operation, and got several strong crewmen to drag the 24-foot barge across the deck. They got creative and lowered her with ropes. The captain now ordered the master's mate, John Snow, to take some sailors and go ashore and check if the place was uninhabited and then return at once. Some didn't know how to get off the ship fast enough and fought each other for a seat. The first batch of men rowed the barge to a sandy beach on a corner of what appeared to be an island, and then they stayed there with the barge. The entire crew was mad as hell at this betrayal. May the earth swallow them whole. Meanwhile, rain came down in buckets and a northern wind picked up, making the sea even rougher and the stay on the wager ever more perilous. Still, Bulkeley and his strong men got the 18-foot yawl and the 25-foot cutter in the water. The captain gave his first Lieutenant Baines orders to take the yawl and check the place for habitation. He gave a stricter order to bring back the yawl and the barge if he couldn't persuade the master's mate to return with her. The lieutenant had been livid about the mate's behavior, but once he got to the beach, he had a few men row back the yawl and stayed behind himself. The crew was quickly descending into an each-man-for-himself mentality. The island looked like it couldn't sustain life, but few were willing to return to ferry supplies from the ship to land. Once they landed, they wanted to stay. Meanwhile, 25-year-old purser Thomas Harvey, who until a few weeks ago had been a midshipman on the Centurion, was in charge of the ship's provisions. He ordered the crew to gather all the essential supplies they needed, like flour, guns and ammo, maps, medicine, a compass, and a Bible. All the while, the relentless waves rocked the wager back and forth, and any moment now, the crew expected the ship to fall apart. After several hours, most of the wager crew had been ferried across to the island. I say most, because the carpenter's mate John Mitchell and a dozen or so crewmen refused to leave, and threw a going down with the ship party. Boatswain John King, the crew's boss, also decided to stay. King had been lying ill in his hammock for a month now, but the adrenaline rush had him up and running. Not to order the crew around, but to live it up before it was all over. Meanwhile, Gunner John Bulkeley was on a desperate search to salvage the logbooks. Logbooks served as evidence in court, but lo and behold, all books had vanished, including the personal journals of Gunner Bulkeley, Midshipman Byron, and others. A gunner, a warrant officer on the ship, didn't need to keep a journal, but Bulkeley had. Naval adventure stories were very popular in England, and publishing his version could fetch him a pretty penny if they ever got back. With the official logbooks and the personal ones gone, it was clear this had been ordered. Someone didn't want anyone to know about their actions. Case in point, a little later, Bulkeley found part of the master's logbook on the shore, ripped to pieces. Meanwhile, Byron and Campbell urged the captain to get into the yawl and go to shore. Cheap refused. He'd be the last man to leave. But the midshipmen convinced Cheap that those left on board had no interest in leaving, ever. At last, the captain conceded. The men helped the captain out of his bed, carried him to the yawl along with his belongings, including arguably his most valuable possession, Commodore George Anson's letter naming him the captain of the wager, and rowed him to shore. What Cheap saw ashore was a most sorry sight. A bunch of weakened, numb, and helpless castaways sitting on the beach in the pouring rain. He did a quick head count. Some 140 had made it to the beach. That included Captain Pemberton, 3 lieutenants, 2 corporals, a sergeant, the surgeon, and some 20 Marines of His Majesty's Land Forces. This was a frying pan fire situation, though. While they managed to save their skins from immediate destruction on the ship, the wet, cold, and hungry men had no shelter, no food, and couldn't expect a European ship to sail past in this remote area, and where even were they? Cheap remained the wager's captain, and the crew was still being paid as long as supplies were taken from the ship. But a marooned crew ain't an obedient crew. Cheap would have to find a way to maintain control and keep them alive as long as possible. The wager, stuck between 2 large rocks, was taken in water midships, and the thundering waves steadily pounded her to pieces. Sooner or later, the idiots who defiantly remained on the wreck were going to drown, if they hadn't already. Well, those on the ship were having the time of their lives now that the commanders had gone. The men broke into the lazaretto, busted open the casks of brandy and wine, and drank their way into oblivion and almost certain death. As the day progressed, the drunks plundered the cabins of anything valuable, clothes, money, and swords and pistols. They dressed themselves in the richest apparel they could find and pretended to be lords, wielding their weapons, ready to kill anyone who came back on board and tried to stop them. The slither of beach on the unknown land was not the best place for the Wager survivors to spend the night. The sickly crew might not survive the drop in temperature after dark. So the strongest of the weakened men ventured inland to find some shelter. They braved the swampy grass and entered the woods, looking for anything that would make their involuntary stay somewhat better. Not far from the beach, just beyond the tree line, they found several man-made structures, wigwams. The domed huts, 10 feet across and 6 feet tall, were covered with brush and had one entrance. Inside they found lances and other weapons. The huts looked abandoned, and they'd seen no people, but they might be out there, lurking. The midshipman quickly brought Captain Cheap over, and put him in one wigwam with some of his officers. Several officers occupied another, and the master, the master's mates, and some midshipmen took the third. The other officers and those of lower ranks would just have to fend for themselves. Once the captain got settled into his hut, he ordered Midshipman Campbell to take the yawl and convince the men still on board to come ashore. And also, secure some powder and ball, please. Cheap needed some weapons to keep the castaway crew in line. When Campbell climbed back aboard, he was stunned at the sight of the drunken crew. Some were singing psalms, others were fighting, others were swearing, and some lay drunk on the deck. And yes, some drunks indeed had stumbled into the rising water and drowned. Campbell decided not to interrupt their merrymaking. Clearly, no one wanted to be saved, and grabbed some casks of powder from the quarterdeck and started loading them into the yawl. 2 men came at him, yelling, "Damn ye, you shall not have them, for the ship is lost and it is ours." A third drunk came at Campbell with a bayonet, yelling, "Damn you, you've carried a straight arm all the voyage and you shall suffer for it." And with that, he threw the bayonet at Campbell. He missed. Campbell turned around. All right, time to go. He got into the yawl and rowed back to shore. Come nightfall, apart from the officers crammed into the wigwams, most other crewmen slept in the mud under a large tree, where Gunnar Bulkley had started a fire. It was hard to keep it going in the rain, and that night it got so cold that it would be a miracle if anyone survived. Not everyone did. The following morning, the storm still raged, but everyone got up. Well, 3 men didn't. 2 invalids and a crewman were dead. The officers huddled inside the wigwams barely slept, constantly worried that the Indians might be lurking somewhere and would use the cover of night to ambush them. They were likely outnumbered, and even if they weren't, they were too weak to take on any attackers. Captain Cheap, himself a walking wreck of a man, wanted to get everyone off the island, if this even was an island. But to do that, they were gonna need a bigger boat. Building one would take months, so they'd have to survive for months. To survive for months, they needed to salvage as many supplies of the Wager as they could. No one had thought of food while they were in a fight for their lives, but not having eaten anything for 36 hours, they now became acutely aware of their hunger. But all that had been brought over from the ship so far were a few pounds of biscuit dust. At last, a small group dared to venture a little further inland on the hunt for food. Keeping their eyes peeled for Indians who might be friendly or who might not, they stayed close to the beach. They saw no land animals, just birds. And they found wild celery, which they brought over by the armfuls. It was a godsend. Celery would cure their scurvy. They didn't know what caused scurvy, a lack of vitamin C or what vitamins even were, but they had figured out over a century ago that eating fruit and vegetables calmed the malady of the sea. One man had shot a seagull, which the 82-year-old cook Thomas McLean skinned and boiled in a pot. He added some of the biscuit dust to thicken the water, and this soup was served in the few bowls that had been salvaged. After devouring the tasty meal, everyone got sick. Food poisoning. First they thought the herbs they'd found on the island were the culprit, but they quickly realized that the bag had contained biscuit dust that had been swept off the floor of the bread room and had been shoved into a tobacco bag that still had tobacco dust in it. It had contaminated it. Now everyone was worse off than before. The rain didn't let up, and the temperatures dropped to around freezing. But if the cold didn't kill the next batch, the hunger would. Captain Cheap put a team together to go to the wreck, find food, and get those idiots off the ship. Their continued rebellion, with the bosun among them, could inspire those on land to disobey orders. Rank and order should be restored. Curiously, Cheap put gunner John Bulkeley, not his right-hand man Lieutenant Robert Baines, in charge of the scavenging trips. Cheap had sussed out that unlike the gunner's superior Baines, who just drank when the going got rough, and who had remarkably not followed the captain's strict orders, Bulkeley was a man with a plan, and better yet, everyone seemed to respect him. Ranks went out the window when lives were on the line. However, as Cheap predicted, when the petty officers called for hands to row the boats to the ship, the men refused. The ship was lost. No one had to obey anyone anymore. Midshipman Campbell tried to argue till he was blue in the face, but people got so mad at his pleas that he feared for his life. Gunner Bulkeley and Carpenter Cummins had better luck. They organized a crew, rowed to the wreck, gathered guns, powder, ball, and a little bread, and they also brought back a few of the men who were all partied out. But when the mutinous men stepped ashore in their fancy dress, the captain was not pleased. The lieutenant of the Marines, Thomas Hamilton, and the purser, Thomas Harvey, put their pistols at the fake lord's chests. "Take it off now!" They immediately disrobed down to their greasy trousers and dirty checked shirts and were disarmed. Rank and order were restored. Sort of. On May 16, 1741, 2 days after the wrecking, the seas were so violent that no one could approach the wreck. Gunner John Bulkeley took charge of building a shelter. He got several strong men to hold a cutter up the beach, flip her over, prop her up, and start a fire to keep them warm inside. Once it stopped raining, 2 groups set out to find food, always checking the woods for any lurking natives. One group headed for a mountain, but found the woods too dense. They returned with a few birds they'd shot, and more celery. The other group went to a smaller mountain, which was surrounded by water, so they couldn't go around it. It was so steep they would have to cut steps in the side to climb up. For now, they went in the other direction and found another sandy beach where they found limpets or sea snails, mussels and other shellfish, enough to feed everyone, a little. Some of the wreck had washed ashore, but sadly, none of the watertight casks containing food, and more sadly, there were bodies. The sight of the horrendously mangled bodies, tossed by the waves, smashed against the rocks, being picked at by carrion birds, was traumatizing for some. Still, their need for food was greater than their disgust, so they easily caught the carrion birds for another meal. The dead bodies were buried in shallow graves. In the evening, the boisterous weather whipped up massive waves. On the very unstable wreck, the unruly Mitchell gang demanded a boat come and get them, but the waves made it impossible for any boats to get out there. The boatswain got impatient and hauled up a gun from the quarterdeck, aimed it at the officers' huts and fired 2 shots. They flew just overhead. A direct hit would have destroyed the wigwams and probably killed a few inside them. So now they wanted to be saved. The following day, Captain Cheap, none too pleased that the men had used cannonballs to send him a message, ordered Midshipman Campbell and 3 other petty officers to bring Team Mitchell to shore. But the mast they'd cut to prevent the wreck from rolling over lay alongside, and with the mad sea raging, they couldn't hope to try to get on board. On their return, the captain said it couldn't be helped, but their mutiny had to be stopped. There were already signs of the crew getting mutinous on land. The following day, May 18th, the weather cleared somewhat, and the salvage crew could reach the wager wreck. They brought back some barrels of wine, brandy and rum, unable to get anything else. The gunner and the carpenter made holes in the deck to drain the water. They also scuttled the carpenter's storeroom to dig up some much-needed tools. The salvage crew had noticed a strangled crewman on deck, likely killed in a dispute over the useless spoils. Meanwhile, the survivors still didn't know whether they were on an island or the mainland. Finally, one group climbed to the top of the smaller mountain. Once on top, they got a pretty good idea of the lay of the land. Yes, they were definitely on an island, 2 miles across and 4 miles long. They were surrounded by wilderness and wild seas with foamy breakers that would swamp and sink little boats. They named the small mountain Mount Misery. The Bulkeley crew, with part of the ship now drained of water, entered one hold and pulled out watertight barrels of flour, peas, beef, pork, oatmeal, and more brandy and wine. They also found dead bodies. Captain Cheap meticulously registered all the goods brought on land. and transferred everything to a storage tent that was erected from canvas sails next to his newly built tent. He also built an armory to store all the salvaged guns and ammo. He was planning on rationing the supplies, but rations weren't handed out yet. The foraged shellfish and celery would have to do for now. The captain had armed his bunk buddies, the Lieutenant of Marines Thomas Hamilton, the wager surgeon Walter Elliot, and the purser Thomas Harvey. They stood on the beach whenever a boat came in to ensure no one could steal anything. The survivors used the canvas and other materials retrieved from the wreck to build their own tents. Like ranks stuck together in a kind of village that now formed, just as they had on the ship. The captain of His Majesty's Land Forces, Robert Pemberton, put his home next to the tents of the Marines. They put up a hospital tent, where the surgeon Walter Elliot and his mate Robert Elliot, no relation, helped the sick. The fires were kept burning for warmth, cooking, and as a beacon for any possible passing ships. Their village was shaping up nicely, and the survivors named every place around them. The water in front of their beach became Cheap's Bay. Mount Misery was the mountain overlooking their village, and the largest mountain was later dubbed Mount Anson, and the island they were on was named after their old home, Wager Island. On May 20th, 1741, the Mitchell gang was finally brought ashore. When Captain Cheap saw Boatswain John King, he fumed King was a rogue and a villain for not boatswaining the crew, and for allowing the Mitchell gang to go nuts. In a show of force, Cheap knocked him to the ground with his cane, where the boatswain remained motionless. He looked dead. Was he dead? A few minutes later, King recovered from the blow, and saw the captain standing over him with a cocked pistol in his hand. The boatswain defiantly offered his bare chest. "Take your best shot." But Cheap calmly turned around, only saying he deserved what he feared. With the situation finally under control, Cheap started rotating in more crews who, weather permitting, rowed to the wreck, crawled on board, and brought back anything useful they found. At the same time, they worked to salvage the scuttled longboat that was buried under part of the hull. As they cut away the gunwale to get her off the ship, they discovered several drowned men. Then, a shock. Several barely clothed, long-haired Indians in a canoe paddled up alongside the wreck, carrying lances and slingshots. They bowed and crossed themselves, apparently aware of the Roman Catholic religion and how it related to these white folk. The olive-skinned people were the Coescar, the people who wear animal skins, the Nomads of the sea. They appeared to have thought that the wrecked Wager was a beached whale. But when they saw the white men, they figured they were Spaniards who lived far to the north. The Coescar lived in their canoes where they kept a fire going and only came on land a few days at a time and then built the wigwams. Now, they couldn't understand each other, but the survivors waved their hats beckoning them to come closer. While the king had ordered to save the savages from themselves so they could become happy people, right now the English were the people who needed to be saved. The salvage crew handed them 2 bales of cloth as an offering and directed them to the shore, to Captain Cheap. Midshipman Campbell got in a boat and guided them to shore and to the captain's residence, where Cheap greeted them ceremoniously. He gave the men sailors' hats and a soldier's red coat. While the men were extremely courteous, they didn't care for wearing clothes and took them off the moment they left. However, in return for the offerings, they gave the survivors a bunch of mussels, the largest and the best the survivors had ever seen or tasted. Then again, as one crewman pointed out, hunger is a great sauce. After a while, the Coescar left again in their canoes. Would they ever see them again? The salvage crew brought in barrel after barrel of food and liquors. Captain Cheap became so paranoid that when Gunner Bulkeley, the man in charge of the goods retrieval mission, started making nighttime trips to the wreck, Cheap ordered him to stop, too worried he might steal stuff. Bulkeley was mad about the short-sighted order. At night, the weather and the tides were better, and in the moonlight they could see just fine. Plus, there was no time to lose in getting all the provisions out before what was left of the ship fell apart, taking all her treasures with it. The captain didn't budge. This was the second clash between the gunner and the captain, with many more to come. Bulkeley muttered that others would go on nighttime salvage and he wouldn't be there to stop them. But, you're the boss. Meanwhile, everyone eyed the provisions that had been stored but not distributed, as they continued to scour the beaches for shellfish and snails and gnawed on the salary. Hunger persisted. Strong men searched the beaches at night for any casks of meat and flour that had washed ashore. Those who were too weak to venture out at night died of hunger, or were driven to the last extremity: cannibalism. John Byron recalled a boy cutting a liver from a dead washed-up sailor and had to be held back to stop him from eating it. Luckily, on May 22nd, the Coescar returned and brought another heap of mussels and 3 sheep. It was anyone's guess where they got these animals from. They must have traded with more northern tribes. The Coescar stayed all night because of the extra rainy weather. Again, they were given clothes to cover themselves. But as the Coescar left, they again took them off. Winter had arrived on Wager Island. Rain turned to sleet, sleet turned to snow, and the temperatures dropped below freezing. On May 25th, 11 days after the Wager's wrecking, Captain Cheap was finally organized enough to start handing out rations. Each man got half a pound of flour and 1 piece of pork for 3 men per day. On the evening of May 26th, the Coescar returned, and they brought their wives this time. The crew gave the women hats and the men trousers. The Coescar left again, signing they would bring more sheep. From this moment on, serious effort went into trying to get the longboat, the largest of the transport boats, to shore. This was a tough task and quite dangerous. By cutting away the gunwale and the lines and drilling a hole into the Wager's hull, they finally managed. On June 3rd, the Mitchell gang of 10 defiant and troublesome crewmen packed up and left the village. They believed they were on the mainland and planned to move north, but when they realized they were on an island, they made their camp a league away, on higher ground next to a lagoon. They'd scavenge their own food, raid, plunder the wreck at night. While no one was sad to see them leave, these men were dangerous. Once they armed themselves, they could show up, raid the village, seize the provisions, and steal the boats. In fact, later that day, Quarter Gunner David Buckley told the captain that the Mitchell gang had plotted to blow him and his closest pals, Surgeon Elliot, Purser Harvey, and Marine Lieutenant Hamilton, up. Sure enough, they found a trail of gunpowder running to the captain's tent, but it hadn't been ignited for some reason. Rumor had it someone with a conscience had persuaded the Mitchell gang not to go through with it. Another rumor had it there was no gunpowder trail at all. With the mutinous Mitchell gang's departure, Captain Cheap once more had to fear a mutiny among the castaways, and he couldn't expect any help from Captain Robert Pemberton of the land forces. In his little camp, the Marines only obeyed him, and he obeyed no one. According to Cheap, the man had lost all sense of honor or the interest of his country. The captain wanted to captain, but the surviving crew was getting restless. Some order remained, but few wanted to work on anything, and, huddled together in their misery, the crew began to speak ill of the captain, and they openly threatened the petty officers that backed him. They wanted the gunner to be in charge. By now, everyone was aware that Bulkley had warned the captain multiple times about being too close to shore, and advised him to head for the safer Juan Fernandez Islands. But Cheap hadn't listened, and now they were in this mess. But Bulkley wouldn't hear of it. He obeyed the captain, and so should they. The men piped down. It wasn't lost on Cheap that many crewmen now blindly obeyed the gunner. On June 4th, the yawl, cutter, and barge were at last considered seaworthy enough to go further afield for goose hunting and such. But Bulkley, picking up on the murmurings of discontent, secured the oars and hauled the boats up every time, just in case someone decided to steal them and disappear. The Wager wreck was steadily falling apart. Most of the planks between the decks were gone, and the hull planks bent outward. But the crews kept trying to salvage what they could from the wreck. Carpenter Cummins now had plans to re-engineer the damaged longboat so it could fit more people. He'd saw it in half, add another 12 feet or so to the 36-foot hull, and add a second mast to better navigate the choppy waves that surrounded the island. Captain Cheap was all aboard with the transformation plan, though what he planned to do once the longboat-cum sloop was finished was anyone's guess. Cummins estimated it would take months to replace the rotted planks and extend her. And everyone, weak or strong, had to help. Either by working on the boat, by hauling over sections of the wreck that washed ashore, by dismantling the Wager further, or by scouring the woods for material they could use. But to pull off his vision, Cummins needed help from another skilled craftsman. However, his two mates, James Mitchell and William Oram, were both deserters. While no one figured Mad Mitchell could be brought back into the fold, Oram might. But how could they pry the carpenter's mate away from the Mitchell gang without them killing him for his apparent betrayal? A secret mission was in order. Bulkley again was put in charge. Commodore Anson aboard the Centurion moved north alone. They were met with disaster after calamity after catastrophe. So much for the calm Pacific. But when the weather finally calmed, they were in no condition to attack Valdivia. So they cruised back and forth, hoping to see the other ships. But no one showed, and they assumed everyone had perished and headed for the island of Juan Fernandez, where both the ship and the people were restored. The trial sloop showed up a few hours later. The Commodore helped bringing the sick ashore and ordered all his officers to lend a hand as well. 167 were landed, but 14 didn't survive the transport in the cold air. It took nearly 3 weeks for the strongest to recover. But they still hadn't seen the Gloucester, the Severn, the Pearl, the Anna, or the Wager. They worried that since another 2 weeks at sea would have rendered the Centurion a ghost ship, they expected the other ships had suffered that fate and wrecked. They also worried that Rear Admiral José Pizarro of the Spanish fleet had rounded Cape Horn and was on their heels. The ship's condition and the lack of crew, their 60-gun ship had 30 hands to man her, meant they were a sitting duck for all but the smallest privateer or pirate. Meanwhile, on Wager Island, several chests of waxed candles of all sizes and types, bales of cloth, bales of stockings, shoes, some clocks and mercantile wares were brought over from the wreck. On June 7, 1741, Captain Cheap ordered Midshipman Henry Cousins to roll up a salvaged cask of peas from the beach to the store tent. Cousins said that the cask was too heavy and turned away. A midshipman disobeying an order from his captain? Cheap shouted Cousins was drunk. Cousins replied, "With what should I get drunk unless it be with water?" The captain fumed, "You scoundrel! Get more hands and roll the cask up!" Cousins half-heartedly called for more hands, but when no people came, he cussed out the enraged captain, who then struck Cousins with his cane. Cheap ordered the midshipman arrested for drunkenness and imprisoned him in the well-guarded store tent. Mr. Cousins continued to make a ruckus in the tent, shouting loudly so that everyone could hear it that he was come into those seas to pay Shelvocke's debts. George Shelvocke was an infamous British buccaneer who, 2 decades earlier, had wrecked his ship the Speedwell on one of the Juan Fernandez Islands. After rebuilding the ship into a new ship, he continued pirating before returning to England. Cousins yelled, "Though Shelvocke was a rogue, he was no fool, and by God you are both!" The audacity! Cheap lunged at Cousins and raised his cane to strike him again, but the guard held him back and said that no one should strike his prisoner. The captain left, but Cousins' rage hadn't cooled, yelling and cussing to heart's content, and then he tried to break open a cask of brandy in the tent. His continued rage made the rest of the survivors restless, and the captain, fearing an uproar, figured it was best to release the man. Cheap felt more and more cornered. Were Cousins' tent mates Gunner Bulkley and Carpenter Cummins perhaps egging him on to provoke a mutiny? He would have a little chat with the duo. Well, after they got the carpenter's mate back. On June 8, 1741, Gunner Bulkley and Carpenter Cummins went to the deserters to ask them to return to their companions and do their duty. They didn't have high hopes they'd be successful in convincing anyone, but this was really a scouting mission. Get the lay of the land so they could get to William Oram. The deserters were gathering wreckage to build a punt they'd take the 4 or 5 leagues to the mainland. They were so convinced of the brilliance of their plan that they dismissed any offers to return. The following day, the surgeon's mate, Robert Elliot, checked on the deserters. Bulkeley tagged along to execute his covert mission to convince the carpenter's mate Orm to come back to the main camp with him. Bulkeley waited for Orm to be alone. It was tricky, because John Mitchell needed his particular set of skills to build that punt. He might not be able to finish it on his own, and he'd make sure Orm paid if he left him in the lurch. Once Bulkeley got Orm separated, he quickly told him that the captain wanted him to help the carpenter to modify the longboat, his only real way off the island. There was a pardon in it for him from the captain if he left his seditious group and joined them. And so, Orm deserted the deserters, along with 2 others. Back at base camp, Midshipman Cousins, still getting drunk, or perhaps being kept drunk by others, got into a swearing match with the surgeon Walter Elliot, who was visiting Bulkeley's tent, Cousins' home. Elliot was palling around with the devious captain, and the midshipman was still fuming about how Cheap had treated him. When Elliot left, Cousins followed him out, taunting him and swearing at him until they finally came to blows. However, the surgeon easily overpowered the midshipman, tied his hands behind him, and left him to be found by the next person that came that way. It was hours before Cousins was freed, and this whole thing enraged the midshipman even more about the captain and his posse of loyalists. Not long after that, he got into a shouting match with another one of the captain's close allies, the purser, Thomas Harvey. Captain Cheap was pleased to see that Gunner Bulkeley had succeeded in luring Orm back. And yet... That evening, the captain summoned Gunner Bulkeley and Carpenter Cummins to his tent. The captain was joined by his unwavering backup dancers, First Lieutenant Robert Baines, the purser Thomas Harvey, Surgeon Walter Elliot, and Marine Lieutenant Thomas Hamilton. The captain wanted to have that little chat about the rumblings of discontent among the people in their tent and beyond. Bulkeley was a little surprised. Now he wanted to consult his officers? Maybe the man should have consulted them on board. Then none of them would have been in the current hellhole of a situation. But the gunner wisely kept his mouth shut. Instead, Bulkeley and Cummins assured the captain that the people in their tent generally thought very well of him. Also, in case he was wondering, and he obviously was, they would never engage in any mutiny against him or any other officer for the public good and His Majesty's service. The captain said, "Oh no, I'm not suspecting you of anything. You two are the only ones on the ship I'd put any trust or confidence in." The backup dancers were like, "Are we a joke to you?" Oh, one more thing. Someone had stolen a barrel of flour and half a barrel of gunpowder that night. They wouldn't happen to know who'd done it by any chance. They didn't. On June 10, 1741, everyone lined up to get their daily rations. The bosun's servant, Diego Findal, a Portuguese boy, didn't speak English very well. He brought in the allowance of wine and said something that Bosun King, Midshipman Cousins, and cook Thomas McLean understood with some difficulty. Apparently, one of the men had his allowance stopped because he wouldn't work. Midshipman Cousins decided to intercede on the man's behalf, who'd already said he didn't care. Purser Harvey, perhaps tired of the argumentative midshipman, yelled, "A mutiny! The dog has pistols!" Without saying another word, he pulled his pistol, aimed it at Cousins' head, and fired. It would have been a point-blank hit had the cooper, John Young, not knocked the purser's pistol up with his elbow, just as he pulled the trigger. The captain and Lieutenant Hamilton in the captain's tent heard the gunshot. The lieutenant ran out with a loaded firelock pistol to see what had happened. Hamilton saw Cousins and the purser raging at each other, with Harvey calling the midshipman a rogue and incendiary. The lieutenant instantly believed it was Cousins who had fired the gun, despite the fact that the man had never had a weapon ever, and yelled, "Captain Cheap, here's Cousins come to kill us!" The captain, ready for this occasion, snatched up a cocked-loaded pistol from the table, jumped out of the tent and yelled, "Where is the villain?" He was fed up with his authority constantly being undermined. Cousins, equally fed up with the captain, stepped up to Cheap until they were almost nose to nose. Cheap, in a reflex he'd come to regret later, put the pistol against Cousin's cheek and fired. Bulkeley was in his tent when he heard the 2 gunshots. That was strange. Firing guns in the rain was an accident waiting to happen. Midshipman Byron was in his tent when he heard the gunshots. He ran out. He saw everyone was just standing there, staring at the midshipman on the ground, and Cousins, bleeding out, just staring back. Byron kneeled by his messmate's side. Cousins tried to speak, but no words came out. He took Byron by the hand, shaking his head. He was dying. The crowd began to stir. A revolt was brewing. Cheap saw the whole situation getting explosive and ordered all hands. Lieutenant Hamilton came to Bulkeley's tent and told everyone to come. When Bulkeley heard that Cheap had shot Cousins, he asked whether they should bring their guns. The lieutenant said yes, but as Bulkeley reached for them, he reconsidered. Better not bring weapons to this powder keg. In the pouring rain, everyone stood at attention, facing a line of armed officers, the captain, the purser, the surgeon, and the 3 Marine lieutenants, Hamilton, Robert Ewers, and William Fielding. The captain explained to the tense crowd what he had done. Bulkeley, staring at the row of armed men glaring at the unarmed crew, felt it necessary to point out to the captain that they were all unarmed. The captain dropped his firelock pistol to the ground and said, "I see you are. And I've only sent for you to let you all know that I'm still your commander. So let every man go to his tent." Everyone obeyed. Bulkeley sussed out that the captain and his posse really suspected he and Cummins could and would get most of the seamen on their side. But he hadn't brought the guns, so they were cool now, right? Right? Bulkeley and the captain walked up to Cousins still lying on the floor, his elbow on the ground, resting his injured cheek on the palm of his hand. He was alive, and appeared sensible, but speechless. Everyone felt the captain's behavior was unacceptable, and once more a mutiny was rumbling. Cheap immediately ordered some men to carry Cousins to the hospital tent, where the midshipman got treatment. However, things weren't so straightforward. Surgeon Walter Elliot refused to touch the patient and left the surgeon's mate to handle it. Perhaps he felt his mate could handle a simple gunshot wound just fine. Perhaps he felt that if Cousins died under his care, others might suspect him of killing him out of revenge for the fight they had a few days earlier. But the crew believed that since Cheap hated Cousins, the surgeon didn't touch him out of fear of angering the captain. Carpenter Cummins later said the surgeon had told him as much, and the people hated the captain ever more. Then again, Cummins might have just wanted to stir trouble. Then again, after Robert Elliot dressed and probed the wound, he felt a ball somewhat below the right eye, but unsure whether he could handle it, he asked the surgeon of the Marines, Vincent Oakley, to assist him. At first Oakley agreed, but then changed his mind, believing it would anger Captain Cheap. Fortunately, Robert skillfully removed the ball, but a piece of it had broken off, which was left behind. A second surgery was necessary. Cousins, being strong and healthy, could easily recover with proper care. 3 days after the shooting, he was removed from the hospital tent and was lying on the ground, under a canvas strung up between bushes. He asked to be taken to his tent for more comfort and to be among friends. Bulkeley asked the captain to grant Cousins this favor, believing a great leader showed mercy to enemies in distress. This was also an excellent opportunity to get back in the crew's good graces, but the captain raged, "No, the scoundrel shan't be gratified. I'm so far from it that if he lives, I will carry him a prisoner to the Commodore and hang him." Apparently, the captain figured mercy would appear like weakness in front of the unruly crowd. Well, his austerity backfired spectacularly. The hatred for the captain began to boil over, with folks saying Cheap should have just shot Cousins twice to put him out of his misery, instead of leaving him to die a little at a time alone in a cold, wet place in pain and desolation. Bulkeley watched the captain become ever more grim and even felt the man was losing his mind. The wager's loss obviously weighed heavily on the man, as if with it his soul was lost as well. On Wager Island, work on the longboat continued, the hunting expeditions continued, and despite the wreck having become very unsteady, the salvage operations continued. When the hull breached, many casks fell into the bay, so several scavenging missions were underway to retrieve all the casks that had washed ashore. Some were found 2 miles away from base camp. During one of these scavenging missions, seaman John Anderson, clambering over rocks, lost his footing, reaching for a piece of beef. He drowned. Anderson was immediately gathered up and buried that night. Some of the seamen still held to old superstitions that the spirits of an unburied body would come back to haunt them. The Mitchell gang was also scavenging for stray casks. They threatened to shoot anyone who tried to stop them. A little later, a seaman who'd gone foraging on Mount Misery was found stabbed and mangled in the bushes. All fingers pointed to the Mitchell gang. But those at base camp left him unburied, fearing the wrath of Mad Mitchell more than a potential spirit haunting. Meanwhile, Bosun John King, a guest at Gunner Bulkeley's tent, got so quarrelsome that he was kicked out. The captain was surprised it had taken Bulkeley that long. Perhaps birds of a mutinous feather flocked together? A week after Midshipman Cousin's surgery, the surgeon's mate went in again to retrieve the fragment of the ball and a piece of jawbone. Cousins asked Robert to deliver the pieces to Bulkeley, along with the ball that had been lost but since found, to preserve evidence of Captain Cheap's deed. Bulkeley hid the package in his tent. The following day, the longboat was repaired, and Carpenter Cummins now cut the boat in half to lengthen her 11 feet 10.5 inches by the keel. But his life-saving work was slowed down, because few really wanted to work on it. On June 24th, Mr. Henry Cousins, midshipman, after languishing 14 days with the wound he had received in his cheek, passed away. They buried him with all the formality they could muster. Sailors rarely cried, but there were a few fiery, venomous, resentful speeches. All seemed to agree. While the deceased was a meddling fellow, that was not sufficient reason to kill him. He'd not been armed since coming ashore, so shooting the midshipman in the head on suspicion without inquiry or trial was something worse than manslaughter. Once they returned to England, Captain Cheap would get his comeuppance. They'd make sure of that. So far, they'd buried 45 men, and including the 7 deserters, there were now 100 survivors left on Wager Island. Two days earlier, on one of the boating expeditions, Lieutenant Bain saw the Coescar carrying 4 sheep in their canoes. He realized they were coming their way, and it was cause for alarm. Those at base camp had heard the deserters were plotting to steal one of the Coescar canoes so they could make it to the mainland. The deserters, with their camp on higher ground, would be the first to see them paddling over to Wager Island. The following day, a crew was sent out in the yawl to protect the Coescar from a possible deserter assault, and they would place armed guards with the canoes while they were on Wager Island. The Coescar arrived on Wager Island the day after Cousin's funeral in 5 canoes, laden with seal, shellfish, and the sheep, and they brought their wives and kids. A total of 50 men now descended on Wager Island. Apparently, they planned to stay for a bit. They didn't speak each other's languages, and hand signs also didn't seem to work. But the survivors got a front row seat to the ways of the Coescar, building the wigwams and fishing. During this stay, the men showed the Indians a mirror, who, when they saw themselves, made excited gestures and could hardly be persuaded to look away. During their stay, the 50 Coescar did everything they could to feed the 100 castaways. The women, holding a basket between their teeth, dove deep into the bay for such a long time, no one would have believed it if they hadn't seen it with their own eyes. When the women came up, they had caught something from the ocean floor. What are those? Mussels? Lost pieces of meat? No, sea eggs, prickly urchins containing 4 to 5 yolks, which tasted well and were very nutritious. But the men were baffled at the upside-down culture, where the men were homemakers, gathering firewood and the like, and the women did all the hunting. The women showed the castaways where they could get more mussels. The Wagerians quickly killed 2 of the sheep the Coescar had brought and made a very tasty meal, though it didn't stop the men from stealing flour and booze from the store tent. On June 30th, one of the seamen died, and the Coescar sat close to the dead body, carefully covering him, always looking on the face of the deceased with abundance of gravity. During the burial, they remained grave and solemn, and when all the men took off their hats during the service, they were very attentive until the end of the ceremony. On July 6th, rather oddly, the cabin bell came ashore, but it wasn't attached to any wood and no other part of the ship was near it. From now on, the bell was used to call everyone together for food or meetings. All seemed right with the world, but good things never last. A few days later, the Coescar packed up and left with their wives and children. They stripped the bark from their shelters and took their secrets with them. It wasn't immediately clear why they'd left. Perhaps they were looking for provisions like seals. Perhaps they just upped and left, since they never settled in one place for long. But some claimed this must have happened because the deserters, who were often drunk from the liquor they'd stolen from the wreck, started getting handsy with the women. They didn't expect to see the Coescar again. And they didn't. After the departure of the lifeline called the Coescar people, a cloud of despair fell over those on Wager Island. On July 10th, a month into their ordeal, the wreck, disintegrating day by day, delivered less and less. The shellfish had been picked clean from the beaches, and the longboat that would take them to salvation was far from finished. Now the captain had to make a dangerous call. Either reduce the rations and risk a riot, or don't and face starvation in the near future. Reductions it was. He could handle a riot. Some crewmen finally managed to catch some rockfish. The first one was given to the carpenter, their savior, as an appreciation for his hard work. Midshipman Byron found a dog that the Coescar had left behind. It became his blanket and protector. Then starting July 16th, the watch reported they heard guns being fired at sea. This continued for 2 more nights. The ominous noise only made the people more restless. They didn't realize this was the Anna Pink, which lay in a bay some 3 miles away, sounding the night shift. The Pink had enough room to hold them all to carry them to Juan Fernandez, but they didn't know she was so close, and the Anna didn't know the Wager had wrecked. On July 22nd, Gunner Bulkley realized the stay would last longer than they first expected and decided to build a proper house. The gunner, Carpenter Cummins, and the strong men went to work to build a home on a flat spot in the camp from wood, tree branches, leaves, canvas, and reeds. They improvised tables and chairs, and it soon started to feel like a home. The home had 14 separate cabins and could house some 20 people. But once it was finished, Bulkley had a cabin to himself. Their home would be larger than the captain's tent and was regarded with a mix of jealousy and admiration. And some refer to it as the hotel. Obviously, this Bulkley guy knew what he was doing, and his determination drew many lost souls to him. While most people wanted to just give up, seeing the gunner get to work, they also started fabricating their own houses and huts, though none as large as the hotel. But base camp turned into a proper town with 18 houses in it. The town even had a main street. They also put a tent over the longboat to keep the workers from being exposed to the never-ending rain and hail. Gunner Bulkley had developed a daring plan for when the longboat was finished, recognizing that the sloop wasn't fit for any enterprise other than the preservation of life. He'd gotten his hands on Sir John Narborough's Voyage to these Seas, which had a detailed account of his exploration of the Patagonian region. Between 1670 and 1671, the naval officer Sir John Narborough undertook a secret expedition to Patagonia and the Pacific Ocean, intending to claim territory for England and spy on Spanish activities in the region. Narborough wasn't prepared well, and after crossing into the Pacific, encountered Spanish garrisons at Coral Bay, one of the most heavily fortified parts of the Chilean coast. Narborough pretended to need supplies from the Spanish. They were starving, but they looked far too healthy, and it was all very sus, so the Spanish garrison refused. Narborough returned to England in 1671 without having achieved any of his objectives. But the Spanish were spooked by the whole thing and sent out expeditions to find evidence of the English in the region. They found nothing. After Narborough's death, his account of the voyage was printed in 1694 as part of a collection of explorations. Bulkley had been studying the account extensively for the last few days. He planned to take the longboat turned sloop, the cutter, the barge, and the yawl, sail through the Strait of Magellan and make for Brazil, a neutral territory, a journey of some 3,000 miles, and return home from there. While the strait offered more shelter than the Drake Passage, the journey would be no picnic. It was a rocky maze with unpredictable shallow waters and glacial blasts that could wreck any boat easily, but there'd be plenty of places to scavenge for food and water. Bulkeley went around the camp and presented his Strait of Magellan plan to the officers, and everyone agreed this was the way. Bulkeley showed his plan to the Wager's navigator, Master Thomas Clark, who studied the route and deemed this plan offered a good chance of survival. But he may have had ulterior considerations. He had his young son with him. But before Bulkeley could present his plan to the entire crew, Captain Cheap announced his plan. Cheap, who had figured out the location of Wager Island, planned to use the longbow-turned-sloop, the cutter, the barge, and the yawl to go 350 miles north, past Siloé off the Chilean coast. From there, they'd sail to Juan Fernandez and rendezvous with Commodore George Anson and any other surviving ships of the squadron. Then they would continue their mission to attack places, find the elusive Manila galleon, plunder it all, and become very wealthy men. He fully expected his men to do their patriotic duty and not retreat from the enemy, but truth be told, he was hurting for glory and wanted his redemption. Bulkeley was baffled. Yes, his plan was a mad undertaking, but the captain's plan was murder. Did the captain want to throw everyone into the hands of a cruel, barbarous, and insulting enemy, aka the Spaniards? The men had to do their duty all right. As valuable officers of the British Navy, they had to live to fight another day. The plan to go through the Strait of Magellan while a few thousand miles longer was their best bet, their only bet to make it home alive. Bulkeley started collecting signatures on a petition backing his plan, so that the captain couldn't ignore the will of the majority. The whole thing was headed for a showdown between the gunner and the captain. But that is for the next episode, Run to the Devil. Until then. If you're enjoying this series so far, please leave a like to help me out. And if you don't want to miss the next episode, subscribe.